What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Occupy Fantasy Football Podcast Week 2 edition. A little first look at the NFL main slate on Sunday. I'm Brian Jester, your co-founder and co-host here at Occupy Fantasy, joined today, as always, by my usual co-host, Mr. Chris Rooney. What's up, Chris?
Ryan, happy to be here. I'm personally looking forward to moving on to week 2. Week 1 was not the best for me. Probably like a lot of people. I know you discussed this the other day on Twitch for your Twitch followers. Benny Snell, that's who we're about to talk about. Boston Scott kind of did not help me out at all in week 1. So looking forward to week 2 for sure.
Well, you answered my first question for me. I was going to ask you how it went, but it sounds like we were
There you
both,
go.
yeah, both of our,
Look,
both of our ROI graphs probably looked very similar in week 1. It sounds
yep.
like.
Yeah. So, but you know what? Process over results. That's how we pick ourselves back up and get over our losses and move on to week 2, right? So that's what we're here to do.
Sounds good. So
Yeah.
in this episode, we're going to recap some of the week 1 usage notes that stood out to us from a fantasy football perspective. We're going to talk about, of course, air yards. We always love to talk about that. And while it's only been 1 week, we do have at least some data to work with now. Talk about some of our top game stacks. And then we'll talk about just any other notes that could potentially help you build lineups for FanDuel and DraftKings on Sunday. A quick reminder before we do get started, our lineup builder is free again for week 2 for Occupy Fantasy members. So build up to 150 lineups for FanDuel or DraftKings, or just build a handful of lineups using our optimal lineup criteria with the Occupy Fantasy lineup builder. OccupyFantasy.com/lineup builders where you can learn more. And if you're a member, again, free access again for week 2. So, Chris, let's talk about week 1 here. We had no preseason games, not a ton of training camp and off-season practices. So a lot held true. Things we expected to happen did happen, but there was always surprises. So let's start with for you, who were some of the biggest surprises and standouts, or some of the biggest usage notes that were interesting to you?
For sure. So, this is primarily obviously a DFS show. That's what everybody's watching, listening for. So we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive. We're going to talk about some players here that I think people wouldn't necessarily be looking at in season-long leagues, obviously, because that's what we need to get value in our lineups. And so as far as surprising usage, let's start with everybody's favorite team in the NFL to talk about. It's, of course, Washington football team. I think we got some answers. There was some speculation, obviously, but amongst a lot of analysts about the usage at the tight end position here, and a lot of people did sort of buy into the hype of Logan Thomas in week 1, and obviously if you did and you played him in your lineups, you probably feel very good about that. And we'll be giving you some more information here that'll make you feel even better about him moving forward. Last year, Brian, we were sort of in a similar spot with the Raiders and Darren Waller, where everybody expected him to have a large role in that pass game, but we weren't really sure till we saw it. His DFS salary stayed pretty affordable for the first few weeks of the season. Logan Thomas, exact same thing here. 8 targets in that week 1 game against the Eagles. Led the entire team, had more targets by 1, but more targets than even Terry McLaurin. So, and very obviously important for us to get tight ends into our lineups that have some upside at the salary that he has for us. This week, he's still just 3,600 on DraftKings, 4,700 on FanDuel, playing the very leaky Arizona Cardinals, who I think everybody at this point knows, at least historically, they've given up a lot of fantasy production to tight ends, and we're at least hoping that'll continue for one more week with Logan Thomas. Staying with Washington, this is one of our value plays in week 1 at running back that was kind of a bust for everybody. Antonio Gibson only had 1 carry in the red zone. Not great, Brian.
Not good.
Our old friend from Tampa Bay last couple seasons, Peyton Barber, he had 10 red zone carries in this game. Obviously, he had the 2 touchdowns. Everybody knows that. And just an amazing 29 yards on 17 touches. Fantastic average going on there. But look, we don't care about that. We just see that the opportunity is there. It looks like, we talked about this offline, if you will, a little earlier. Coaches just seem to kind of look at Barber and they trust him a little bit more when it gets closer to the goal line. That's really the best explanation I can personally come up with. I don't know if that's your read on the running back situation with Washington as well.
Yeah, it's surprising because Adrian Peterson gets released, and his post-release interview basically says they got rid of me. They drafted Antonio Gibson to be the guy. I expect him to be the guy. And
Mm-hmm.
then Ron Rivera, week 1, before the game says we're going to use a three-headed committee approach, and of course coaches say this, and then we expect once the rookie gets on the field, he starts to take more of the action. But again, Peyton Barber, if you listen to a lot of the hashtag film grinders, one of the best vision, one of the best technical runners in the NFL, despite what we all think. And I imagine a lot of football guy coaches see this and recognize that and continue to give him the work. So yeah, his yards per carry average, not surprising it's that low when 10 out of his 17 carries were within 10 yards of the end zone. So, but again, interesting to see. The most important thing here is Logan Thomas. You mentioned Darren Waller. Co-founder Waleed and I did our FFPC draft before the season started, and we were trying to find that next Darren Waller. And Logan Thomas was on our short list. It's kind of these guys that we don't really know much about. The opportunity is there in front of him, and Logan Thomas actually exceeded the opportunity we expected. You talked about the 8 targets, but also he was just involved. 91% of the dropbacks he ran a route on. So, again, these are the types of guys that we're looking for, and he's still underpriced.
Yeah, and you say 91%, obviously big number. I mean, I just hope people get the point. That's actually through week 1. That was the only people that ran more routes as a percentage of their team's passing plays, Evan Engram and Mark Andrews. So Thomas ahead of your Travis Kelce's and George Kittle's, although he was hurt a little bit. So if that usage is going to stay up there, he's going to be a very, very viable play at that position all season long.
Yeah.
Moving on, we have a little bit of disappointing news, surprise in a bad way. Austin Eckler. The target volume it's gone. And you know what? We probably should have been a little more. We should have anticipated this more, is what I'm trying to say here. I mean, no more Phillip Rivers. Phillip Rivers loves targeting his running backs, which we'll touch on when we talk about our next team here. But Eckler only had 1 target the entire game and got down in the red zone, and the work was pretty much split between him and Joshua Kelly, the rookie out of UCLA. Kelly had 4 carries down in that area, Eckler 3. Kelly ended up with the touchdown in that game. To me, it looks like that it's going to be a little bit of a dice roll between those two for goal line opportunities. And, so basically with Eckler, right, we're seeing his salary stay up in that sort of mid-range. We can't necessarily guarantee you he's going to get the floor of 5 targets that he gave us when he was a starter for this team last year. That's a problem. And we can't guarantee for you that he's even going to get the majority of the looks near the goal line. So it really makes Eckler a very, very, very tough play, at least for low risk here, if that's the way the usage is going to shake out with the Chargers.
Yeah, and I mean, at least Anthony Lynn could have gave us some glimmer of hope after the game. The reporter asked him a question about Eckler's usage in the passing game, and they said, you only have 1 target. What's your plan? And we could have heard, yeah, that was our fault. We need to get him more involved in the passing game. We need to get Tyrod some more checkdowns to him. Instead, he said, that's just not what our offense is doing with our running quarterback and our scheme. Completely dismissing the idea of getting him more touches in the passing game. So until we see evidence at this point, it's tough to rely on that.
Yeah, and we were a little misled this past week. I mean, we were operating under the impression that Mike Williams was going to be fairly limited if he was able to play at all, and that turned into him playing virtually the whole game and getting a lot of opportunities. So part of the thesis with Eckler was impacted by that as well. One of everybody's favorite rookies this offseason, we talked about him a little bit on the Week 1 show, Jonathan Taylor with the Indianapolis Colts. He has now been named the starter by Frank Reich here with the Colts because Marlon Mack unfortunately suffered a season-ending injury. Believe he tore his Achilles, I think was what the report is there. Brian, hold me accountable here.
Yep.
So, interesting kind of nuggets with that. Hines did end up playing the most during that game. Now that might have been a game plan thing and how they prepared for the game. And obviously you can never anticipate somebody like Mack getting hurt so early in the game. Mack only played 11 snaps before he was lost for the rest of the season. So the way the game shook out as a whole, Taylor had 35% of the snaps. Hines, again, 53. Hines, a ton of work near the goal line, Brian, which makes sense. He gave us the 2 touchdowns in week 1. But if we believe Frank Reich, it sounds like Taylor's going to be the guy who's going to be more involved down the stretch here.
Yeah, and what was encouraging to see was Taylor's usage in the passing game as well. Like we all talked about him being one of the best running backs, running with the football, and talked about the Colts offensive line. But if Rivers is going to continue to use him in the passing game as well as Hines, now his floor is raised, his ceiling is raised, and I know a lot of people were picking up Hines this week off the waiver wire, and now with Matt gone, it's only a two-headed backfield. It could actually legit be a Melvin Gordon, Austin Eckler light type of
Right.
situation now in Indy. So I think both guys are going to be playable in DFS, but we should be really excited about Jonathan Taylor's usage moving forward.
Absolutely. And just quickly on the Colts before we move on, how about that Paris Campbell, huh?
Woo!
Played a ton in the passing game for them, led the team in targets, tied with T.Y. Hilton. And honestly, he actually kind of looked a little better than Hilton. So I think Campbell is someone that's going to be firmly on our radar here. His price this week is still super affordable as well. The Steelers, the Monday Night Football game. And, this is always an opportunity in DFS. Just to remind everybody that's either been with us or if you're new to the show, DraftKings, FanDuel, they post their salaries for the main slate before those Monday night games are all wrapped up. Typically, they post them on Sunday night. They Steelers come out, they play on Monday. Surprise, surprise, James Conner gets hurt again. And I mean no disrespect to James Conner, but I think at this point everybody kind of expects him to be one of the most injury-prone running backs in the league. We're now entering a week 2 slate where it is a tough matchup against the Broncos that they have, but Benny Snell, one of the probably going to be one of the better low-priced running backs on this slate if he ends up being the starter and getting the full complement of opportunities for the Steelers, which, as we know historically with Tomlin and this staff, that is how they prefer to use their personnel at this position. They want to have one guy sort of lead the way, toting the rock out of the backfield. You may see Jalen Samuels mix in a little bit on third down situations, but without James Conner, and he did not practice on Wednesday, which is when we are recording this, it seems like Snell is going to be in line for a large workload here.
And he looked damn good too. Like we got a lot of
Yeah.
offseason reports about him dropping some weight, looking really good in the offseason, and he went out and showed it. Broke
Yep.
tackles, topped 100 yards rushing, even despite not starting. And then we look at him. I'm just trying to pull it up here. 4,500 on DraftKings, 4,600 on FanDuel. Do we have the same exact situation as last week? Like this really could be the case. And again, he doesn't get to work in the passing game like Boston Scott is supposed to. But again, if that price tag as a 7.5 point favorite, we're gonna have a hard time not lock butting him into our lineups if Connor is indeed out.
Yeah, and if Connor ends up suiting up, because Tomlin said they're going to leave the light on for him, which is going to be super frustrating for us as DFS players. We're probably going to take this right down to the wire on either Saturday night or Sunday morning with that for that reason. Pardon me. We do have James Robinson, at least as a pure salary pivot, available to us, at least on DraftKings. I believe he's 4,400. They are underdogs against the Titans here in week 2, but kind of crapped on him a little bit in the last show.
You
We told you
did.
he's a guy. But the thing is he's not just a guy. He is the guy for the Jaguars. And when we play DFS, we need guys that we can sort of pencil in for those opportunities. He had 16 carries in week 1 against the Colts. He was the only running back who touched the football. Minshew with 5 carries, and another rookie everybody loved this year, at least some of our friends across the industry certainly. Laviska Shenault had a couple of interesting plays there where he carried the football as well. So to me, it looks like James Robinson's going to be the running back here. He's cheap, he's affordable, but that's also for a reason because we still don't expect Jacksonville to be very good.
Right. He got a lot of touches in week 1 as they were actually somehow in control of that game against the Colts for majority of the
Right.
time. Now, if they get behind in the game, do we see more Chris Thompson? I imagine we do. But again, he's still pretty underpriced given his role.
Right.
What about these Baltimore running backs? I know a lot of people are quick to play J.K. Dobbins now after his performance, but I had a feeling. Again, I didn't watch that game fully, and they didn't show it a ton on Red Zone. Uh, that his
Right.
involvement was mostly due to the blowout. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Don't know. I mean, it's super interesting. Looked at the first half usage alone just to try to maybe isolate for that. At least, yeah. So Ingram had 5 carries in the first half. And part of the problem here, Brian, also was Cleveland kept turning the damn ball over. So, but from a fantasy standpoint, that means we still don't really know what Baltimore wants to do between the 20s here because they just worked with short fields far too often early in this game. Ingram had 5 carries in the first half. Dobbins had 4. They both had 1 red zone touch each, which, is this just situational? Were they spelling one guy in favor of the other here? One thing that we do know is that Gus Edwards was a non-factor until the game's result was well in hand. So I think that we can firmly say, until we see more evidence, that these guys are clearly the top 2 for John Harbaugh here. I always get the 2 brothers mixed up. That's on me. But I think Dobbins is probably clearly the better long-term play. He's younger than Ingram. That's obviously why they drafted the kid. But I think that they are going to hopefully, certainly for season-long players or dynasty players that are hoping to get something out of Ingram, continue to run him into the ground while he's still usable for them. But this might be a little bit of a split workload here. Baltimore, we saw this a little bit last year too, right? I mean, they like to involve a lot of the depth guys on their roster because they like to play a little bit up tempo and it keeps everybody fresh when they're on the field. So Baltimore uses a lot of players. Both of these guys are going to be usable for us. I know that sounds wishy-washy, but it really is true in DFS this season.
Yeah, and both still decently priced. So, and no one has a big lead over the other as far as pricing goes on either site, but just something we'll continue to monitor moving forward. All right, a couple tight end and receiver notes now. We have air yards for week 1. We have tight end routes run for week 1 as well. We already talked about Logan Thomas sticking out from an involvement in the passing game perspective. Any other tight ends stick out to you as far as being out there running routes more than we thought?
Yeah, I mean, we were hoping. I mean, I'm going to bring up Mark Andrews. Everyone's going to be like, cool, mention like the highest scoring tight end on the slate. That's great. Everybody knows he's good. The difference here, Brian, is Mark Andrews played even more than we saw last year. And we all know how good he was last year. So at 92% of routes run for Mark Andrews, if he's going to be playing at that level, he is going to be probably the TE1 this year, which means even at like 6,000, which is right around where his salary is on DraftKings this week, if he's Lamar Jackson's top receiver, that might be a bargain, which is how I choose to look at some of this stuff with a player like that. Going back into the value tier, very impressed with the usage for Jordan Akins from the Texans on Thursday night last week against the Chiefs in the opener. Came in at just a hair under 89% of routes run for the Texans in that game, and played significantly more than Darren Fells in those passing situations. Obviously had the touchdown there in that game. Expect that to continue. The Texans going to have to look at their injury report a little bit. We know that Brandon Cooks, even though he played through it, was a little banged up. And certainly, they can't just keep funneling everything to Will Fuller, although that certainly would be nice if we want to play him this week. So look for Akins to be one of those kind of deeper roster options on the Texans that I think is going to be involved here, at least in the first part of the season.
Yeah, and he's looked good doing it, dating back to his rookie year. And there were questions about him splitting time with Fells again. So it's nice to actually see him get on the field in passing situations and be utilized. And again, he's still really cheap, and we're not expecting him to be Darren Waller, but maybe he could be one of those guys. We'll have to see. But let's certainly monitor, and the early signs are encouraging. Now, you mentioned Will Fuller. Let's talk about air yards in week 1. Will Fuller looks like around 10th in the league with 129 air yards, and not just deep shots. He was being used all over the field. He was very efficient, finished with 112 receiving yards. So talk about Fuller and any of these other receivers that stood out to you from whether it's their usage or the fact that they underperformed.
First thing that stands out to me looking at this list that we were able to pull, Brian, is how about the Philadelphia Eagles? We've got a couple of Eagle receivers on here, and honestly, it's just because they let us down across the board. It wasn't just Boston Scott. I mean, Deshaun Jackson was pretty popular around the industry. Sort of a surprise status update as we got to Sunday. Jalen Reagor was good to go, and he had over 130 air yards in this game, and Jackson led the entire league with 214. So, at that level of opportunity here, we should expect these guys to break out, find the end zone. I mean, hopefully, if the Eagles get their offensive line situation sorted out, that means Wentz will stay upright a little bit longer and be able to actually connect with these guys and give us the results we need from a DFS perspective. Devonta Adams. I mean, we wrote him up in the plug for low risk. He obviously smashed. Everybody knows that at this point. Part of the value there with him, it has nothing to do with his salary, because his salary certainly is not a value anymore. It's the concentrated target tree. with the Packers. I mean, it's the chemistry between him and Rodgers. It's the fact that the next best guys behind him on the depth chart are things named Alan Lazard and Marquez Valdez-Scantling. Scantling, another leader here on the air yards chart, but that's just because Green Bay's passing was out of control in that game. I mean, if they're going to call plays that way all year, we're going to be able to use all of these Packers receivers in tournaments, and more on that later. But I was really impressed with Devonta Adams. I think he's going to be someone that we talk about pretty much every week, especially now that Michael Thomas isn't available to us, Brian.
Yeah, so we'll talk about Thomas here in a second, but just to hit on some exact numbers here. So Deshaun Jackson, 214 air yards in week one, only 46 receiving yards. Jalen Reagor, 136 air yards. We saw the big overthrow by Wentz on at least one bomb. He only finished with 55 receiving yards. So both these guys certainly underperformed their opportunity in week one. Other guys that stick out to me, if you're listening to this before the Thursday night slate, both Odell Beckham, perennial underperforming receiver, 129 air yards, just 22 receiving yards. Honestly, getting kind of the Curtis Samuel treatment. Not much to work with on his deep balls. And then AJ Green in week one, 132 air yards, 51 receiving yards. Both these guys underperformed. Potential captain options for Thursday night. And then just one more before I get back to you, Chris. Our guy, Quintez Cephas for Detroit. Kenny Galladay did not practice on Wednesday. And Cephas, 129 air yards, 10 targets, played a ton of snaps. Actually tied for the most snaps of any rookie receiver with CD Lamb. So tons of exciting options to look for in week two.
Absolutely. I want to go back to Will Fuller. His 10 targets in that game against the Chiefs was, nobody else on the team had more than 5 on Watson's 32 attempts. I mean, similar to Devonta Adams, if we're going to get concentrated targets like that, again, I don't necessarily trust this yet. I mean, let's just say it again. Hypothetically speaking here, Brian, if we were going to stack a game involving the Texans, probably want to use Will Fuller heavily in those stacks this week. Just again, a hypothetical I'm throwing out there. Probably want people to really think about that this week. Okay. Beckham on Thursday night. I just want to touch on that again as well. When you mention a player like Curtis Samuel, people who were with us last year, you're going to give them a little bit of post-traumatic stress disorder. I do think that at least Baker Mayfield is a little more accurate with his passes, especially out of the play action. And I think that we will see Beckham realize his opportunity a little bit more than we saw Samuel in 2019. He's not going to be facing, in my opinion, there's not much more of a tougher ask than coming out of an entire summer to prepare for a game than the Ravens and their elite secondary having an entire summer to prepare for you. So now that we're into the week-to-week grind of the NFL season, I really do think that we'll see these Browns receivers perform. Take advantage of them here on Thursday night while everybody's still low on them for sure. So that's the receivers. Why don't we, I guess, taking a quick look ahead, preliminary version of this week's Occupy model at occupyfantasy.com. Some of the usual suspects here, Brian, are projected to lead the slate in targets. Devonta Adams, Julio Jones projected for 10 each. And one other player that stood out to me projected for 10 targets this week, Miami's Preston Williams, Brian. That is certainly going to be an interesting value opportunity here in week one if that pans out. He's 4,800 on DraftKings, 5,400 on FanDuel, and then 9 targets each for DJ Moore, DeAndre Hopkins. So Preston Williams, really the only kind of value receiver at this early point in the week that is popping for an outrageous amount of opportunity that we probably want to consider heavily when we set our lineups this week.
7 targets in week one. Again, was playing the tough Patriots defense. Doesn't get too much easier this week against Buffalo. But again, at his price tags, like you said, tough to get that type of target projections, no matter who you are. So, all right, before we move on to week two, we've already talked about week one for about 20 minutes now. Just want to touch on Michael Thomas. He is playing Monday night. That's not on the main slate. But high ankle sprain. Didn't think it was too serious initially. They come out yesterday and say he's going to be out a couple weeks. Potential IR candidate, maybe even out until the bye week in week 6. So now he's out. Traquan Smith played a ton of snaps in week 1. Emmanuel Sanders, he's there as well. So just real quick, Chris, what are your thoughts on how this is going to shake out and what we should look for Monday night?
Yeah, Traquan actually played the most snaps at receiver, ran the most routes at receiver for every receiver not named Michael Thomas on the Saints. So I think he might be the easiest one to guess. Steps in and has a larger role. I know my speculation privately that I had with you earlier today as we were preparing for the show is that maybe this could be a little bit more of the Alvin Kamara show. We saw a lot of involvement for both him and Latavius, with Latavius taking more of the traditional, if you will, kind of running back touches. So maybe more of that's in play. I guess, for those of you who aren't necessarily as invested in showdowns as we are, first of all, shame on you. But second of all, it gives you the opportunity to really kind of evaluate how the Saints use these players before we get them back on a main slate. So that's good at least.
Yeah, but dude, start playing showdowns. If you're not playing
Yeah,
showdowns,
absolutely.
what are you
I mean, that's
doing?
why I said shame on you. I mean, that's where the bread is really buttered here. Looking ahead at week 2 now. I mean, by the way, I just want to make sure everybody understands with IR. You have to think of IR designations here in 2020 a little differently because of the pandemic. In case you haven't heard, the NFL changed the rules here, where IR is just a 3-week thing. Players can come off after 3 weeks if they're healthy and ready to go. So, we got news this week, for example, that the Jets have IR'd Le'Veon Bell, Denzel Mims. Doesn't mean that those guys are done this year. They both can actually come back. So if the Saints do that with Michael Thomas here, he is eligible to return a few weeks from now. So again, just kind of train yourselves to think about IR a little differently here in 2020.
Yeah.
Our biggest favorites in week 2, Brian. We're going to start with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Very disappointing debut with the Buccaneers for Tom Brady, Brian, but he's a 9-point favorite at home against, I think it's at home anyway, against the Carolina Panthers here this week. Next biggest favorite would be the Steelers, 7.5. They're getting 7.5 points against Denver. We've got the Niners getting 7 points against the Jets, and the Titans getting 9 points against the Jags. Some smaller opportunities here, although these are going to be some of the more popular teams, I think, on the DFS slate, regardless. The Chiefs are getting 8.5 against the Chargers. Baltimore is getting a touchdown against the Texans. And the Cardinals are getting a touchdown against the Washington football team. So, I think first and foremost, when I sit down to evaluate a slate, Brian, I look at these favorites. And to me, that screams, okay, who are the running backs in good situations to perform here? Because if those game scripts pan out, then at least for low risk, those running backs are the ones that are going to have probably more opportunities to hit value for us. And so right off the bat, we talked about James Conner being hurt. Big favorite, Steelers. Benny Snell might be a legit good play, not just a value play for us. Raheem Mostert, Brian. Mostert. Must hurt for me to forget that name if he's listening to this. That was a bad one. We can be mad about that. Yep. Anyway, he had 15 carries in week 1, 5 targets. The 5 targets was super interesting to me because he did not really see that level of passing volume at all when he started to receive more work in the second half of the season and postseason for the Niners. Now, I think he's a really, really, really strong play this week. More information will be in the Daily Plug when that drops on Friday, but it is important to know we did not touch on this earlier when we talked about usage. Very interesting spot with Jerick McKinnon in week 1. He was super involved in the red zone in particular for the 49ers. Mostert with only 1 touchdown in that part of the field. Now, obviously, it didn't really matter because he caught that slant and took it all the way to the house and super met value for anybody who played him. But if he's not going to get touches down there in the red area, it's going to be interesting to see what the Niners do now that we think anyway Tevin Coleman will play more because the air quality situation is not going to be affecting them here. So a lot of big favorites here. Let me just finish that section out for you. Derrick Henry. I mean, we all know what he can do. CEH with the Chiefs. Clyde Edwards-Helaire. We definitely are going to be strongly looking at him on the main slate. And Kenyon Drake against Washington. These are guys that I think that we need to have a lot of allocation to this week. And the model is pretty favorable on all these guys as well.
Yep, I'm going to give you some quick comments on each of those guys. So Benny Snell, again, if Connor's out, it's deja vu all over again. We're all in on him for week 2. Mostert, I agree with you. We'll have to see what Tevin Coleman's role is. Maybe McKinnon's usage in the red zone was a game plan type situation. But regardless, against the terrible Jets, 7-point favorites, Mostert is underpriced, so we should be playing him. Derrick Henry, I was on edge every single touch he got, fading him in the showdown slate on Monday night. Bad problem is he still scored like 19 DraftKings points, and he was bottled up. So now against a lesser foe and a 9-point favorite, Henry should be in smash zone in week 2. CEH, again, I'm curious to see if teams continue to play the Chiefs the way Houston did in week 1. 2 safeties back, force him to run the ball. If that's the case, CEH is going to eat all season. And then Kenyon Drake, again, 7-point favorites against Washington. Drake, red zone usage again. Chase Edmonds did vulture the touchdown from him, but Drake should be in a good spot. So lots of good running back spots this week, Chris.
Absolutely. And before anybody says, well, what about Frank Gore? Just no.
No.
Just that's not happening. It might be happening for the Jets, but it should not be happening for you in your lineups this week. So that's that. I mean, Le'Veon Bell being out touched on that. It sounds like Gore is going to be the guy that Gase is going to turn to. And that's really all you need to know. Please don't play Frank Gore this week. So please hit my mentions and flame me when he scores like 3 touchdowns. It's
please, cool. Yeah, just don't do it. Let's talk about something more positive. Let's close out the show with our favorite game stacks of the week. These are going to be finalized in the daily plug, occupyfantasy.com. Chris does a great job of identifying these game stacks every single week. He Galaxy Brained identified Green Bay and Minnesota, and they went off for about 7,000 fantasy points in week 1. So I'm very curious, Chris, to see who you like in week 2.
Galaxy Brain stack here in week 2. I mean, everyone's going to focus on what I would call the obvious ones here. I mean, it's these high scoring, high total games featuring some offenses people love for fantasy. We have obviously the Falcons and the Cowboys with a 53-point total. We have the Ravens and the Texans with a 52-point total, which hypothetically speaking is a great stack this week. Going right back to the well with Aaron Rodgers and the Packers. They're facing the Lions. It's a 49.5-point total. We have the Vikings and the Colts with a 48.5-point total. Brian, I'm going to go off the board on you. Those are the highest game total games that we have this week. I like, and it should be no surprise that I'm going right back to this, the Carolina Panthers and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. You know, when we talk about game stacks, right? We want to play quarterbacks, and we want, especially if we're mass multi-entering, which you know all too well, we want to try to get the right combinations with these quarterbacks. And I like teams that have players that we can project for a lot of concentrated opportunity, because to me, that means they have the opportunity to hit that 30, 40-point ceiling that we need to reach the top of the leaderboards, to be at least in that top 1%. And then if the balls bounce the right way for us with the rest of our plays, we could be having very, very, very special Sunday afternoons. You know, with Tom Brady, obviously a little bit of a different reality with Tampa Bay, but Chris Godwin was still super involved as far as targets go. Mike Evans was running a ton of routes. He obviously had the touchdown late in the game. Running backs, I think, are a straight avoid here with Tampa Bay, but you know, when we can project targets to be funneled that kind of narrowly to 2 main guys, and no surprise, Tom Brady loves a little slot receiver and Scott Miller. Certainly love these guys in game stacks. On the other side, I mean, nobody needs to be told about Christian McCaffrey and what he can do when they put the ball in his hands. Each of these teams, I think, are going to have a really good chance to have efficient drives on offense, keep scoring touchdowns, move the ball back and forth. And that is exactly the type of game script we need for stacks that pop off. And that is exactly what happened last week with Green Bay and Minnesota. So I'm hoping that is the one that brings it home for people this week. Let's try and continue our streak of, at least, if one of us isn't winning the Millionaire Maker, at least we're giving you the right stack to get there. And so that's what we're hoping to do here.
Hell yes, that is correct. One final note on game stacks, I will say Atlanta and Dallas is going to be very popular, very high total. We always have to keep in mind offensive line versus defensive line matchups in these games. Atlanta, Matt Ryan, they scored a ton of points for fantasy. Julio Jones, Matt Ryan, Calvin Ridley, but they faced a Seattle defensive line that doesn't get a ton of pressure. Now they're going to Dallas. Dallas has a ton of studs along the defensive line. Could be a different story, and those types of situations can end up ruining game stacks. Not saying that's definitely going to be the case here, and we'll definitely have more data as we get the next couple of weeks in the books, but just something to keep in mind. So that'll do it for this episode. Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify. If you're watching this on YouTube, go ahead and click that subscribe button so you get the video version every single week. You get to see my reactions to Chris's thoughts live and in person. And occupyfantasy.com, where you can access to Chris's daily plug. You get access to Occupy Model Ranks every player on the slate, FanDuel and DraftKings. And again, for week 2 for members, the Occupy Fantasy lineup builder is free for members for week 2. Once again, we'll take your money in week 3, we promise. So for Chris, I'm Brian. Appreciate you listening. Good luck this week, and we'll talk to you next week.